Welcome back to the deep dive. We're going deep on recent developments in the South China Sea. You know the basics, so we'll be focusing on the most impactful events and what they mean strategically.
The region's really a fascinating mix right now. Diplomatic strategies, economics, security concerns, every move matters.
Let's unpack how the Philippines and Malaysia approach their disputes with China. It's interesting, both are using UNCLS, but their diplomacy is so different.
Yeah, the Philippines seems to be getting closer to the U.S. on security, like reviving the Visiting Forces Agreement and those joint military exercises.
Makes sense, given their history and China's military presence in the region.
Hmm.
But Malaysia's different.
Oh, yeah, way trickier. It's a tightrope walk. Pushing back against China while depending on them for trade. I mean, China was their biggest trading partner in 23.
So they're trying to protect their economy but not give up their claims. How's that working out practically?
They've been critical of the nine-dash line for sure, but at the same time, they're getting closer economically. It's a delicate balance, that's for sure.
No doubt. This leads to the debate in the U.S. about their global strategy. Some, especially at the Stimson Center, say focus on China as the main challenge and pull back from Europe and the Middle East.
Big debate. It's about resources and how far the U.S. can stretch. Can they stay global, or does focusing on one area mean retreating from others? And what happens if they do shift?
Asymmetric denial is getting attention as a possible U.S. strategy for the Indo-Pacific. What is that exactly?
Well, the Stimson Center folks say it's not about matching China ship for ship. It's about hitting their weak points, making aggression so costly that it deters them. Things like hypersonic missiles, maybe cyber warfare, areas where the U.S. has an edge.
So playing to strengths instead of a head-to-head arms race. What are the pros and cons there?
Pros. Well, it lets the U.S. counter China without overspending, maybe, but critics worry about things escalating. Hard to say how China would react.
Let's talk about Indonesia now. Under President Prabowo Subianto, they've become more assertive, especially regarding the Middle East, denouncing the UN Security Council's inaction, giving more money to the UNRWA. Is their foreign policy changing?
Prabowo is definitely committed to the Middle East, that's for sure. Wants Indonesia to be a voice for peace globally. Promising to open an embassy in Palestine is a big deal, maybe a real change from their usual stance.
But they have that complex economic relationship with China, too. The East Asia Forum pointed out that competition from Chinese imports is causing problems. Possible layoffs in petrochemicals and steel.
Classic problem, right? China's economy is tempting, but relying on them too much has downsides. The question is, how much does that affect Indonesia's stance on the South China Sea disputes?
So they're juggling economic interests with national sovereignty. That joint statement after Prabowo met Xi Jinping, reported in The Strategist, raised some eyebrows. Seems softer on the nine-dash line than they've been.
Definitely worth watching. They've been pretty vocal against China's claims, using that 2016 court ruling to back them up. So this change has people wondering if economics are winning out over strategy.
Could this be strategic? Securing economic benefits while sticking to UNCLS and their stance on the South China Sea? Or are they really changing their approach?
Too early to say, honestly. Indonesia's good at playing all sides, keeping everyone happy. Maybe they're using China for economic gain without giving up territory.
So read between the lines and look at the bigger picture of their foreign policy. It's fascinating how all these things, domestic issues, geopolitics, economics, shape a country's strategy.
Absolutely. And as we keep going with the South China Sea, we'll see even more of that.
Now, there's also this new strategic partnership between Malaysia and South Korea. The Diplomat had a piece on that.
Yeah, it looks like a win-win. Malaysia gets South Korea's tech and know-how, and South Korea gets a solid partner in a key region. Defense, trade, green energy, critical minerals.
Definitely adds another layer to things, especially since Malaysia is already South Korea's third biggest trading partner in ASEAN. I think this could shake things up power-wise.
Worth keeping an eye on for sure. It strengthens the alliances forming against China's rise. Could have ripple effects beyond just the immediate stuff.
Speaking of shifting alliances, that RAND report brought up Trump being back in the White House. How do you see his, well, more assertive foreign policy affecting this already complicated situation?
It's a wild card. Could embolden countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, who want a strong U.S. presence to counter China, but might also cause friction with Indonesia or Singapore, who don't want tensions to escalate.
Seems like navigating all this is a theme, huh? The report also mentioned Europe being affected by the South China Sea.
Right, the Royal United Services Institute brought that up. They're worried that something like a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would impact European defense. If the U.S. has to shift resources to the Indo-Pacific, it weakens their commitment to NATO. Creates openings for Russia, maybe?
So what happens in one part of the world can have big consequences elsewhere. Global security is all connected.
Exactly. Policymakers in Europe, everywhere really, need to be paying attention, got to figure out their own priorities and where they're vulnerable.
It's clear the South China Sea is bigger than just one region. It's where the U.S. and China are really going head-to-head with economics, security, ideology, all mixed up.
Stakes are high, no question. The whole global power structure is changing. And what countries do in the next few years will be huge for the region and maybe the whole world.
Let's go back to the region for a minute. It's not just the big players making moves. Japan, for instance, they seem to be stepping up their game.
Yeah, Japan's Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade is going to be training with U.S. and Australian forces in Australia's Northern Territory. Starts in 2025, according to the strategist. Pretty big deal, especially with Japan's history of pacifism.
So they're realizing they need to get stronger and be ready if something happens, especially with China being more assertive.
Seems like it. The Northern Territory is a great place to train for that kind of thing. Lets them practice complicated maneuvers in a setting that could be pretty realistic. Shows how defense cooperation between Japan, Australia, and the U.S. is growing.
And there's talk of Japan having a more permanent training setup in Australia, like what Singapore's got going on in Queensland. We could see Japan's military presence in the region increase a lot.
Yeah, that would be a big development. A permanent presence means they can work together better, and it makes them a stronger deterrent against threats in the region.
So we have Japan training in Australia, the Philippines getting closer to the U.S., South Korea partnering with Malaysia. Looks like a lot of hedging going on. Trying to be good with China economically, but also getting ready if things go bad.
That's the balancing act, all right. Trying to benefit from China's economy without depending on them too much or putting security at risk.
It's a tough dance. And it shows that this isn't just a two-sided thing. Lots of players, all with their own goals.
Right. And those other players are starting to realize they can make a difference. They don't just have to follow the U.S. or China. They can influence things and look out for themselves.
Indonesia's in a tough spot.
Yeah.
Dealing with stuff at home and all this happening in the South China Sea. And now they've got President Prabowo Subianto.
Yeah, the Jakarta Post had an interesting editorial about the tightrope he's walking. Strong nationalist, close to the military, everyone's watching his foreign policy. Seems like he wants to stay good with both the U.S. and China, but also put Indonesia first.
Not easy to do. How's he doing so far?
He's made some moves, especially on defense, more military exercises with partners like Australia and Russia. The diplomat had a piece on that. Shows he's willing to work with different countries.
But more military stuff can be hard on the Indonesian military, right?
Mm-hmm.
Given what they already have and what they have to do, the diplomat article mentioned concerns about whether they can actually handle it all.
It's a fair point. They don't have unlimited resources, there are logistical issues, and they have to balance what they're doing at home with these international commitments. It's a lot, and it shows that even as these countries step up, they still have limitations.
This deep dive is really giving us a lot to think about, getting past the headlines and understanding the details of how things are changing.
Yeah, foreign policy is never simple. It's messy, unpredictable, and often full of contradictions and surprises.
Speaking of messy and unpredictable, let's talk about terrorism and extremism. That's something Indonesia's been dealing with for a while now, and President Prabowo is going to have to tackle it.
Definitely. The RSIS had a commentary on how Indonesia is handling the repatriation and reintegration of former ISIS members, especially women and children. Not an easy task. They're trying to balance security concerns with being humane.
Sounds like they want to make sure these people aren't a danger, but also give them the support they need to come back to society and rebuild their lives.
That's it. It needs a whole-of-society approach, not just the government, but civil society, communities, families, everyone.
And how they communicate about all this is crucial, right? Shaping public opinion, addressing fears, getting people to support these reintegration efforts.
Absolutely. It's about getting the message right, finding the balance between security and compassion, recognizing that these people aren't just potential threats, they're also victims who deserve a second chance.
That's a message President Prabowo needs to get across if he wants to succeed here.
No question. It's a challenge, but also a chance for Indonesia to show leadership in fighting terrorism and extremism.
It's a chance to show they can be tough, but also compassionate, even to those who made mistakes.
Yeah, it really shows how even something that seems local can affect things internationally, especially in a place like the South China Sea where everything's connected.
Brings us back to Indonesia and Prabowo. Is he really changing how Indonesia does things, moving away from that non-aligned stance? Or is it more of a balancing act?
Probably a bit of both, to be honest. He talks tough, and some of his actions point that way. More assertive, more nationalistic, maybe. But he's also pragmatic, especially about economics.
The Rand report mentioned that too, how countries like Malaysia, South Korea, Vietnam, they're all trying to walk that line between working with China on the economy, but also worrying about security.
They want the benefits of China's growth without the downsides. It's a tough needle to thread, needs smart diplomacy and thinking ahead.
So big picture, what are the key takeaways for our listeners here?
Well, the South China Sea is like a mini version of what's happening globally. The U.S.-China rivalry is the big thing. Alliances and partnerships are changing, partly because of security, partly because of economics.
This deep dive has been amazing for understanding just how complicated it all is. We've gone through the diplomacy, the economic realities, the security concerns that are shaping the South China Sea. It's definitely going to stay in the spotlight.
For sure. And as the U.S. and China keep going at it, what other countries in the region do becomes even more important. They'll shape what happens in the South China Sea and maybe even the whole balance of power in the Indo-Pacific.
Makes you wonder, right? We've talked about how countries are adjusting, trying to balance things out. But what if someone makes a big, unexpected change? What if something inside a country or something happening somewhere else forces them to completely switch sides? What would that do to the whole region?
Big question. That kind of shift could change everything. Other countries would have to rethink their own strategies, and things could get really unpredictable and volatile.
This has been a fantastic deep dive into everything that's happening in the South China Sea. Thanks for joining us. We'll keep an eye on all this and bring you more insights in future deep dives. Until then, stay informed and stay curious.